else?
Thank you. Okay, so we'll now transition into the deer discussion or presentation, and you know, it's been a very busy month for me, and a lot has transpired in the deer program, including another public comment period. And once again, as you can imagine, there were lots of comments related to the deer program and specifically to buck limits in our state. And I was looking at some figures, and it looks like we had over 6,300 total comments relating to the buck limit. So a lot of interest, as you know, and based on our last commission meeting, I felt it was best to simply create a presentation based off of the questions that you had at the last commission meeting. And what you're about to see and hear is just my attempt to more completely answer those questions and help you understand what all data is available and then how it might impact your decision making regarding the deer program. And to begin with, the first question was how many deer were harvested last year. And to give you a historical context for that, you'll see a graph there on the screen showing the deer harvest since back in the 60s, and you'll see now that in 2000, or this past deer season in 2014, that the figure was 164,914. Now, with that in mind, for this past year, there was questions surrounding the buck-to-doe ratio of the harvest. And it's interesting because when I thought I heard one thing in the last commission meeting, but when I reviewed the recording, it was actually a little different question, and it was the buck-to-doe ratio of the harvest. So that's what this graph is an attempt to explain for you. And you'll see that this past deer season that we harvested roughly 95,000 bucks and 69,000 does. And if you look at that percent-wise, you see that 58, or bucks comprised of 58% of the harvest, while does comprised of 42%. And if you create a ratio from that, you had 1.4 bucks to 1 doe. And we all understand the value of looking at these data over time, and you'll see the footnote down here at the bottom, and that's what you see if you go back and look at a 10-year average or the last 10 deer seasons. You see that the average for those 10 years was 1.3 for bucks to every 1 doe. And then there's a range shared there with you. And during that same period, that range of this buck-to-doe ratio for the harvest spanned between 1.2 to 1.4. Now, for just a few more slides, we'll talk about this doe harvest. And if you look at the graphic displayed there, you'll see how the percentage of does that have been harvested over time. You'll notice that back in the mid-'80s that it was around 20%, and that it increased up to 30 around 1997, and then you'll notice a difference or an increase in the doe harvest, which corresponds with when the buck limit was reduced from 11 to 2. We discussed that last month, and we'll talk about that quite a bit more in the next few minutes. But that's when you saw that spike and the percentage of doe harvested. And then once the buck limit drop or increased back up to 3, you'll notice the decline, and I'll point to it now. And then you see a leveling off of the percentage of does, which is currently around 42%. And it may not be apparent at first glance, but if you think about this, this is 100% of the harvest. So everything above this line would make up your buck harvest. And to make that even clearer, if you look at it from this perspective, so you've got 100% of your harvest, and this red area shows the composition of does, and then the blue area shows the composition of bucks. So again, you see the percentage of does increases over time, and it seems to stabilize now to current day. And then again, you see this difference or this spike in the doe harvest that corresponds again to that decrease in 1998. All right, so I'd like to get into to the specifics of the changes that we saw in 1997, 98, and 99. This was a topic of great discussion last time, and I want to say as I begin this that there's quite a bit of numbers here, so bear with me and excuse the data dump, but I'm trying my best as in the creation of this presentation to make it as simple as possible, because if you're like me, the numbers at times can drive you nuts. But we'll work our way through it, and we'll see what all we can garner from it. But as I begin this, I want you to realize that we're referencing 1 year of a reduction in the buck limit and 1 year of an increase in the buck limit. And I stress that because the agency is reluctant to base decision making on the results of 1 year's data. So just keep that in mind, that this is effectively 1 year's data in regards to a decrease or an increase. So if you look at the chart, and commissioners, does it work okay if I use the mouse, or should I stick with the laser? Because I'm trying to think, I'm trying to be considerate of the crowd as well, and they can see the clicker maybe. Mouse works? Okay, thank you. So that way everybody can see exactly what I'm referencing. So in 1997 we had 11 buck limit, and it was reduced in 1998 to 2 bucks, and then the following year it was increased back up, or it was increased to 3 in 1999. And what you have are figures for the total harvest. And I'll give you time to think about this some more once I share the end result. But the end result was that whenever the buck limit was reduced to 2, that we had a 4% overall increase in the total harvest. And then the following year, when we had the increase to 3, we had a 8% decrease in the total harvest. And the next perspective is I'd like to share is, how did this impact the antlered harvest? And again, if you look down at your final results, and the actual numbers are there for you if you want to see them specifically. But whenever the buck limit dropped to 2, we saw a 23% decline in the antlered harvest. And the following year, with an increase to 3 bucks, we showed a 16% increase in the antlered harvest. All right, we've got 2 more ways of viewing this. This is the third of the fourth, because I want to make sure everybody has an understanding of all the popular ways of analyzing this. But this is the antlerless harvest, and the end result being, during the reduction year, a 41% increase in antlerless harvest, and then a 27% decrease in the antlerless harvest in the year that the buck limit was raised back up to 3. All right, last one. Remember, appreciate your patience with the data dump. This one is doe harvest. And remember earlier we talked about this past season that the buck to doe harvest ratio was 1.4 to 1. This could maybe give you some comparisons here, because the end result is that we saw in a reduction year of the buck limit a 42% increase in the doe harvest and a decline of 26% of doe harvest during the year that it increased to 3. And I'm way late in doing this, but I needed to define this specifically antlered, just in case you don't have that background. But to be considered an antlered buck, it's got to have antlers greater than 3 inches. Okay, and antlerless refers to does and buck fawns. Okay, in other words, neither one of those are going to have antlers greater than 3 inches. I'm very sorry for not pointing that out before now. So if you look at the very bottom here at the buck to doe ratio from the harvest, and excuse me, that should say buck to doe ratio instead of just buck ratio, but it is back when it was 11 bucks in 1997, it was 1.9 to 1, and then the year that the limit was 2 bucks, the harvest showed a 1.1 to 1, and then you see the result from 3 bucks, or 1999. Okay, another really good question from last week, or the last meeting, was how many people or how many hunters killed 3 bucks? And this is a breakdown of that. This is the results from last year's season. And 37% of hunters, based on an estimate of 240,000 hunters, 37% of those hunters killed a doe or buck in 2014 and 15. And to break that down further, 65,000 hunters, or 27%, killed at least one antlered buck in 2014 and 15. So to take that another step, you had 20% of overall deer hunters harvested one antlered buck, 6% harvested 2 antler bucks, and 1% killed 3 antler bucks. And now we'll talk about the age structure from this past deer season. What the results show is a 30% or 37% of the harvested antler bucks were yearling bucks, a 1.5 years old, and then 44% for 2.5, and then 19% for the 3.5 and older antlered bucks. And I thought about Commissioner Teague's question from last month, and there was a question about a possible change in this past year's deer data collection. And I thought about that after I went home, and I realized that was a great question, because there was some discussion last year when we realized that one of our biggest deer opening weekends fell the same weekend as the duck season opener, and there was some concerns about did we have enough staff to cover all of those responsibilities. So there was some discussion on how we were going to handle that extra workload, and it turned out that we were able to handle all of that just fine, and it did not result in any less effort in collecting data. So that was a great question, and I'm glad to be able to share that there was no difference in the method or the intensity of sampling from previous years. Now, Commissioner Ripley, I believe, asked how many or what percentage of bucks that were harvested last year were 5.5 years old. And you'll see from this from this graphic that it was 1%, and that is a very low number, but I will share that it's common for other states to have that low of a number as well. It's to kill a 5.5-year-old buck, as you guys probably know, is a fairly rare occurrence. So it's really no surprise that is a lower figure. Now, as I mentioned before, it's real valuable to look at these trends over time and see what we can garner from history as opposed to just one year. And what I'd like to share with you is this is similar to the style of graphic I described earlier that had bucks and does. But if you look at this graph, the dark green area is the area comprised of yearling bucks. And you'll notice how that trend has, or the amount of 1.5 bucks has decreased, or the composition of those animals in our harvest has decreased over time. And you'll notice the figure was around 80 back in 1980, and then has declined to, it fluctuates the last couple of years between 44 and 36. So that's the history of the yearling bucks. You'll see that overall the 2.5 age class has grown, and then the 3.5 has grown over time as well. I will acknowledge, though, that at least from 2009 to 13, that there appears to be a stabilization in that change. So that's how it looks over history. All right. So another question last time was how does our buck age structure of the harvest compare to other states? And this is a very challenging thing to do, and to do appropriately is to make these comparisons from state to state. And what I have before you is the most recent year's average of the number of 3.5-year-old bucks in the harvest of our border states. Now, I need to acknowledge that this table does not provide a one-to-one comparison or an apples-to-apples comparison, because vast differences exist between the deer management programs in nearly all of these states. And to give you an example of that and explain why I feel that way is if you just look at the buck limits and how much they vary from state to state, you'll immediately recognize some vast differences. And what you have there is you have the statewide buck limit in states, and then if you have an asterisk, there's antler restrictions. And that's the terminology that we use to just say that in those states, the animal's antlers have to be so large or have so many points before they can legally be taken. And you'll notice a lot of those states have those restrictions, and we don't have those in Tennessee, so that is one factor to consider. Another one, and this is really unique, but Virginia has an earn a buck program, and that is in place to encourage the taking of antlerless animals. And that is one factor to consider that exists in Virginia. But you'll even notice some other things, and specifically Virginia again, is that they have a different buck limit depending on which end of the state you're on. You'll notice that for North Carolina as well, but depending on where you're in a state depends on the limit. So many states in this chart have incomparable data because the majority of the data, or one of the factors to consider is the differences in buck limits. And another factor to consider is that some states, the majority of their data is self-reported from hunting clubs. And it could be the case that those represent an overall older age structure than would be found in the statewide harvest. So that's another another consideration. And another one is that some of these states don't have a check-in requirement. Okay, so that they get their harvest estimates in most cases from hunter surveys. Now, real quick before we move on, please don't get me wrong. I'm not discrediting the data from these other states. It's just collected so differently that it's not an apples to apples comparison, and that's what I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to realize. So look at this graphic real quick. And in my professional opinion, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee offer the best comparison. And the reason I feel this way is because all three states' data is collected by trained agency representatives. In some cases, the data is reported from hunting clubs. It helps me to make this comparison because I know that trained agency staff collected it. And I think that should bring confidence to you as well. But some things to think about, or another layer to think about, is that in comparing these three states, you have a 29% for Kentucky, 20 for Missouri, and 19 for Tennessee. The Missouri figure is their non-antler restriction data, because like you saw in the graphic before, you may recall that Missouri has antler restrictions in some areas, but I was able to get data from Missouri that was from not inside those areas to help do this comparison. So we've got the Kentucky data, and then we've got the Missouri data, which did not include antler restrictions, and then ours as well. But something I think that's valuable to recognize from this short comparison is that you see quite a difference in the percentage between Tennessee and Kentucky, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a great big increase in the number of 3.5-year-old bucks. And it's just something to keep in mind in decision making, that sometimes percentages may think us, or may misrepresent what we or what the final numbers will tell us. So that's a consideration. Now, let me back up just one more time and say a few more things about these states and how I feel about the final comparison about these states. Is that one thing to note about Missouri is that they're considering changing from $3 to $2. Okay, so that's one thing that we've certainly got in common. Another factor to consider is Missouri is a much larger state than the other two states. And as you guys know, Kentucky and Tennessee are fairly, or pretty much the same size. Kentucky has a $1 limit in shorter seasons. So really, I've shared all this information to tell you that out of those border states, I think this is the best comparison. But really, what's important is right there. It's tough to make comparisons state to state. And I think it's most important that we look at Tennessee and focus on the here and now. And that brings us back full circle to here and to the distribution of our age structure. And even better yet, we've got a lot of historic data to give us a long-term view of this. Now, with this in mind and the data right in front of you, in my professional opinion, you've got three options to try to affect the balance of this age structure. The first would be an antler restriction, which I am elated and excited that the Commission is not considering today. The second is changing the duration of the deer season. And as far as I know, that is not under consideration as well. And the third is adjusting the buck limit. Now, the probability is such that a decrease in the buck limit will eventually lead to some level of increase in the harvest of older age class bucks. However, to what extent, no one knows. And this is why TWRA is not recommending a reduction. And what may appear as resistance is a lack of clarity of knowing exactly how it will turn out in the end. The agency doesn't know if the juice will be worth the squeeze, and as a result, no recommendation has been made. However, if the commission chooses to reduce the buck limit, the agency suggests the change be allowed to continue long enough to document the results. And then, from my perspective, that would mean a minimum of 5 years. Doing so will allow the agency to truly see how the reduction impacts the buck age structure of harvested antler deer. And with that, Commission, I'd be glad to entertain any questions.
Questions from the commission?
On our age structure data, what, with our current check-in process, is this age structure coming from staff being out on person and aging these specific deers?
Yeah, what occurs is each year during our busiest harvest weekends, which are the muzzleloader, opening weekend of muzzleloader and then opening weekend of gun season, we have trained biologists, technicians, all different staff members are at check stations and physically examining these animals and aging them. And then that data is compiled and then compared over time like you see before you.
Okay. Just one more little thing and it might be me not. Did you have some more recommendations? Was there one more slide?
Yes, I did, but I just felt it appropriate to pause.
Okay, good deal.
Other questions? Commissioner Bledsoe? Oh, Commissioner Cannon? I couldn't see over top of him.
At the last commission meeting, we asked you to develop a proclamation where limiting the bucks to 2 bucks would be considered. And in our packet, we had two proclamations, one of which is red line and appears to answer that very question. Nitty question related to that red line one, but on the second page of the red line proclamation 15-03, in the notes below the table related to the gun and young sportsman, the statewide antlered buck limit is 3, and that was not red line. I'm assuming that was just an oversight, needs to be changed to 2 if we're going to consider 2 bucks. Is that correct? Okay. And I'm sorry to be nitty, but I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cannon. Anyone else from the commission with questions for Mr. Yost? Yes, sir. Commissioner Swan?
One question. When you're talking about the percentage of does harvested to bucks, are you including bucks with antlers of less than 3 inches in with the doe harvest in your correlation there?
When I talk specifically does and bucks, does would be all females and bucks would be all males.
Okay, so when you're talking about does, that doesn't include any that are considered antlerless, right? Yeah, antlerless bucks.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Anyone else from the commission? Let me ask for the audience there.
Well, I had one quick question. Just for clarification, in Tennessee, a deer with antlers less than 3 inches can be checked in as a doe, correct?
It would be checked in as an antlerless buck.
Okay, so I've never,
And it would
I've never
not-
looked at that graph, obviously, but, just for clarification.
That's correct, and it does not count towards your statewide buck limit.
Right, I was aware of that, I just didn't know how it was, it's never happened, I've never seen it, so, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you have any questions from the audience? Comments? All right.
Needs to be amended.
If there's going to be, it needs to be amended now for the committee.
I'd like to move to amend Proclamation 1503 by changing the statewide limit for antlered bucks from 3 per year to 2 per year.
Do I have a second? Any other discussion? Okay, on the committee, is committee vote? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. I asked, didn't I? Did you have a comment? I did. I did. Are there any other amendments to this proclamation?
I've got an amendment, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to propose an amendment in Unit L to extend deer season 5 days from where it ends now to the Friday before the juvenile hunt for does only. Our goal is to increase the doe harvest, and right now it's 3 a day, and I don't know whether that's working or not, so 5 extra days doe only might help that.
I'll second.
And is there discussion on this amendment? Or you're saying then to just extend it for 5 more days, then it would end the day before juvenile season opens on Saturday?
Right
Think
now
on-
it ends on Sunday.
On point of clarification, deer season traditionally ends the first full weekend in January. That Sunday when it ends, Monday morning, antlerless only until Friday, and then juvenile season opens the
Correct.
Saturday and Sunday.
Right.
In
And this
Unit
is-
L
this is-
only,
And this is
antlerless only.
antlerless only, this is private lands is what I'm not talking about the WMA proclamation, it's just this proclamation.
Okay. Before we vote, I'd like for Chuck to express his opinion on it.
Well, this is just my opinion. Obviously, this isn't something that we have considered fully as a staff, or our staff has considered. But some of my first thoughts on that idea is that there is the WMA component that we've got to be mindful of. It sounds like y'all are intending for this to not affect the WMAs, but another consideration would be with an interest in increasing the age structure of antlered bucks. One thing that you got to be mindful of is the impact a late season like that might have on buck fawns. I would just ask you to consider that. And then another observation is there's a enforcement component there as well, that whenever you increase the length of a hunting season, there's a lot of manpower that goes into enforcing these regulations, and I'm sure that our agency would like time to consider what that might mean.
Well, I don't, just to respond to that, I don't think 5 days is a long period of time to extend it. The juvenile hunt is already that weekend. And why would that 5 days be any more difficult on the harvest of button bucks than the previous week or the whole season?
Well, I'm not suggesting that it would be any harder on them. I'm just suggesting that it may lead to more of them being harvested, and I just wanted you to consider it. It's a time of year, yeah, well, you guys have hunted enough to realize that generally that yearling buck's the quickest one to jump into the field, and that may lead to his demise, and we just need to be mindful of it.
Commissioner Teague? None? Any other questions or comments from the commission? From the public? You want to vote on, the committee want to vote on that then, on this amendment? Okay. All those in favor of extending Unit L for 5 days immediately for doe harvest only, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? I'm sorry.
Start over. Public, make sure it's private land.
So all of the committee that is in favor of increasing the antlerless deer season for 5 days on private land only in Unit L, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Everybody okay to move forward?
One,
Yes, sir.
one more question, just pertaining to if we do go tomorrow to a $2 limit. What WMAs across the state offer a bonus buck that would not count towards that?
Give me just a second here, please, to see if I can access that information. The WMAs that you have before you offer bonus buck opportunities, and I may stand corrected here in just a minute. So for those of you regional biologists out there, if you realize there's something missing there, let me know, but I believe that's a complete list along with the region.
Okay. And these do not count towards the statewide bag, so
That is correct.
it would just be more opportunity for people to travel to these WMAs, so.
Yes, sir. And some of these are quota or non-quota hunts. So I guess I should acknowledge that in some cases you would have to be drawn to participate in these hunts.
But you're saying this whole list is bonus bucks, not just the ones highlighted bonus bucks?
That is correct, the entire list.
Okay.
Commissioner Whitson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in light of that public comment we heard earlier about sort of transparently communicating with the public and making sure the hunters know what options are open, I think this is not an insignificant thing that these bonus opportunities are available, and I would just suggest that perhaps Director Carter and the chairman would maybe think about a way to communicate this opportunity pending tomorrow's ultimate decisions. But if this is the progress, that this is an important bit of information that some folks might have to dig a little deeper to find, and it'd be nice for them to know it's available.
Thank you. I think that's a great idea, because if we do go to 2, I think we need to make sure they understand there are opportunities to still kill the third buck, and I think that's a great idea that we do enough notice that people do understand that, so there's no confusion there. Are we through with the deer at this time?
I've got a little bit more if you guys are comfortable with me moving forward.
Let's go.